So tell us about the job of a White House stenographer.
Well, I started there in 2002. I was working for a contracting company. They had a contract with the White House. It was a stenographer with the press office. And so I worked in the Bush administration, 2002 to 2007. I left for a little while, 2007 to 2010. I did some communications work for like a group that put on the Richmond Marathon. And then that job fell through in the downturn. So I came back to the White House 2010 and worked again as a stenographer for the press office contractor till about 2014. We became federalized, and then we became federal employees. And after the 2016 election, I stayed on for 1 year and worked for President Trump. It didn't end well for me in 2017. There was, the whole cancel culture thing really caught up to me. And that's what I wrote my first book about. But what I wrote in Joe Biden Unauthorized is basically the viewpoint of someone who was in between the gap between what the press talks about and what really happened. I was there in Ukraine with Joe Biden. I was there in Poland with Joe Biden.
Well, yeah, take us through a day in the life of a stenographer. So if you're in D.C., are you going to the White House every single day?
Yes. So we had an office in the in the Eisenhower Executive Office building. We were on call.
That's next door to the White House, right?
Next door to the White House.
Is that where the vice president's office is?
Yeah, his office is on the second floor. In the Bush years, we had an office on the first floor, and then later we're moved to the fifth floor, sort of way off in the upper alcoves.
And does that building connect to the White House through like an underground tunnel or something?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
We always walked across West Exec Boulevard to just.
So every day, as long as you're in D.C., you're reporting for work at the sorry, what is that building called?
Eisenhower Executive Office.
The Eisenhower Executive Building. 5 days a week, and then tell us about a typical day.
So typical day, show up in the morning. With the Obama White House, it would be, for me, I covered Joe Biden primarily during that time, 2011 to 2016. Joe liked to talk a lot. He liked to work a lot. So it was a pretty heavy workload for me. People ask me,
covered him. Does that mean you're supposed to go everywhere that he goes?
Well, that was the general idea, except because he's the vice president, he doesn't get as much press attention. So I would be in the office receiving transmissions of speeches he did in anywhere he was in the country. So if he was in a national location, so campaigning in Ohio or something, there was the White House Communications Agency would put together a transmission for me that came specifically for my purposes to make an immediate transcript. And they wanted the transcript done immediately. So the day in the White House to start was really, we'd look at the schedule, see what Joe was doing. Maybe he'd have an interview in his office with a magazine writer. I would go into the office, give them a recorder. They would record it without me in there and then give the recorder to me later to use to make the transcript. If there was a TV interview with him, I would go into that room, plug my my recorder into their TV feed, make that recording, and then go and make sure there was a transcript. Some of those transcripts were released publicly, but a lot of them weren't. Like TV, say they were released, they were called on the background, closed press, because the TV group didn't want the transcript out there ahead of their publication. So the
rule of thumb was any communication that was public communication would get recorded. So if it was a speech, if it was an interview or a press conference, and then what about something in between where it's just, some kids come to the White House and he's going to meet with kids at the White House? Is that something that would get recorded or not?
Not for Joe Biden, usually not, but sometimes. We did that with the First Lady. She did a lot of kids' events. The president would do these after-dinner receptions. Joe Biden did a lot of after-dinner receptions. I stayed late for that a lot. So it was a long day. And, working for Joe would start a 15-minute conversation and turn into 45 minutes.
But if he's meeting, let's say, with a world leader, is that something that you guys would record or not?
Not at all. And never in on his phone conversations or his personal meetings. So, and then when he went abroad, he would have press along with him. And if he had press along with him, he needed my services there to make sure anything he said to the press was recorded for the record. transcribed for the record.
And is there any confidentiality that you have to sign to be in this position?
I never signed a non-disclosure agreement, and I was not, because I was at the edge of the press, I never had a top secret clearance. So I was never a top secret or, confidential clearance. Everything I heard was, spoken to the public. So I was sort of like at that same level as the press.
And the bulk of your job, then, it sounds like, is sitting in an office at a computer, typing up transcripts of audio or video recordings.
Right, exactly. Yep, a lot of hours.
And therefore your direct interaction with these various men, Biden in particular, would be when you're there setting things up or taking things down before or after his interview, right?
Yeah, in the room with him during the interview. I kept, we were trained, don't talk to the principals. We didn't go in there and say, hey, they didn't know who I was. They knew who I was by who I was working for. They knew the press officers that they hired that were, the staff that were directing me to do my job. That's, President Obama, President Bush, President Trump knew what we were doing there. We knew they were sort of on the team. They didn't know our names, and that was fine with me. It was a low profile job. Go in, do your job, go home. And, with Joe Biden, there was some international travel. That was interesting and fun.
So are you saying Joe never knew your name?
No, he never knew my name.
Would recognize the face, though?
Yeah, on a trip, sure. He would sort of look at me and see, yeah, I recognize that guy. As far as I knew, we never had a conversation. I met him once in a receiving line for a photograph for a Christmas party. And he really actually paid more attention to my wife than me. So, there's Joe.
Well, good thing you didn't have a daughter with you.
Yeah, right.
That's just a joke, but there certainly is people who've compiled videos of Biden acting in what many people think to be an unusual way with children. While we're on that subject, do you have any comment about those, people referring to him as Creepy Joe in seeing the way that he is kind of touchy with children, or not just children, but with adults too?
I talk about that in my book, and I never heard anybody say anything. None of the women who work for him, and most of the people who worked in his press office were women, ever complained about anything like that. I never heard anybody in his staff say anything like that. And frankly, I think it was it's the ugly side of politics. I mean, people attack each other, their character unnecessarily. It's gotten pretty out of hand in our thing. But I think what I talked about in the book was, I think there was an aspect to Joe, and people really like the book because it's fair. I mean, I didn't really hammer Joe Biden. It's not I want to hammer Joe Biden book. It's here's a guy who's running for president. This is what you have to know about him. I don't think he's going to be a good president. I didn't vote for him. I think Donald Trump is doing a great job. Vote for Trump. But this is what you're going to see in this book by somebody who worked closely with him for 6 years, traveled with him abroad. And as I wrote,
to be fair, because what I really want to do is set up the basis for your knowledge and opinion before we get into what that is. So you're a Joe Biden expert primarily because you've had to digest every one of his press conferences, his speeches, right? Anything that had to be recorded, you were right there the day of having to record it yourself. So it comes from that. It doesn't come necessarily from personal one-on-one direct interaction with him. It comes from having to listen to everything the guy says.
Everything he said, every personal story. I heard about his Aunt Gertrude who made the rice pudding, all those things. And it was over and over and over. And and there were some speeches that were really great. I talk about those in the book. And there were some, there was gaffe episodes. I mean, and then
sometimes you'd be recording the speech and you're probably thinking to yourself, did he really just say that? What the heck? Am I transcribing this properly?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, sometimes it was pretty serious. There were some really serious things. And, it was,
and what is your explanation having listened to him so much, what do you think was going on in these gaffe situations?
You know, he had this saying that he always said in the beginning of a speech: no one ever doubts what I say. The problem is, or no one ever doubts I say what I mean. The problem is I say all that I mean. And all the, audience was always laugh line. But that's really kind of true, because a lot of times he spills the beans, just like he did not too long ago when he said, we have the biggest voter fraud, program in American history. And I don't know if that was a gaffe that he went back and said, I didn't really mean to say it, or it was really the truth that he spilled out. That's the thing with Joe Biden. You have to sort of sift through all that he says. As his stenographer, I listened and listened and listened. Some of it was really pertinent. A lot of it was just Joe Biden BS. There's thousands of hours of Joe Biden BS that I've listened to in my life.
What do you consider Joe Biden BS?
Well, when he says he would talk about the kind of when he would pull up his past, the amazingness of his past. I did this. Some of his war stories were really kind of out there with the BS factor. He would talk about going to Afghanistan and being on the top of the mountain in a helicopter and being rescued by the troops. And there was a lot of self-aggrandizement around it. That's what I call Joe Biden BS. There's a lot of self-aggrandizement to what he says. That's politics. That's part of politics. But for him in particular, there was a lot more of it than I heard with Dick Cheney, than certainly I heard with Vice President Pence. So, there's that sort of showman's kind of car salesman aspect to him.
Did you catch him in a lot of contradictions, where in one circumstance he said this is what happened, and then in another speech he says this is what happened?
Yeah, and I couldn't tell you off the top of my head right now, sitting what those contradictions are. But I mean, it was almost like, no, that's not what they said, and it would happen pretty regularly. I mean, just sort of.
I'm talking about his own past.
No, I know. Talking about policy contradictions.
Well, no, sorry, I don't mean policy. I mean, like, if he's telling stories about growing up or stories about serving in this or that, did you catch him in some fibs where he had, one time said I graduated, in the top 10% of my class, and the next time he says I graduated in the top 50% of my class, that kind of thing.
So he used to do this story, and he did it repeatedly, about going to this Camp Bondsteel. It was in Bosnia. And he had this grand story about he got in this taxi cab driver, and they were driving up, and there was this big camp being built up on the hill. And the taxi driver looks up and says, "Oh, look, America." And he points at the construction project. And Joe said they pulled up to his story was always, we pulled up to this group of American service members that were there as sort of the checkpoint. And I pointed to them and said, "No, that's America." Well, the racial makeup and the identity makeup of the checkpoint would change based on who was in the audience. Sometimes there was a white general, sometimes it was a black colonel, sometimes it was a Hispanic sergeant. All that would always change. So there's a lot of ebb and flow to what Joe Biden really says, right? There's a lot of makeup about it.
Mm-hmm. And what have you heard? One of the controversies is where he finished in his school, that he actually performed very poorly. I've seen actual numbers where undergraduate he was bottom 10%, and law school same way, something like that.
He used to say, I went to Delaware, and I think he said I graduated with C. So here's another Joe Biden story from Delaware. He used to say in front of college crowds, I played college football. That's not really true. He said, I went to University of Delaware and I played college football. But he never ran on the field as a member of the varsity Blue Hens University of Delaware team. He never wore the uniform and ran on the field for a varsity game. He practiced with them in the spring. He was hurt. He was about to start up with them. He practiced with them. He was kind of on the practice team, and then he decided he quit, and that was it. So he used to say, I played college football, which is true, but there's a sliver of truth. That's Joe Biden. There's a sliver of truth to it. But if you're in the audience, you think he played college football. I went to Delaware and he played college football. He played college football for Delaware. That's not true. So let's see, you asked about his college. His college used to say, my sister got honors, I got C's, or something like that. But one time he said this, and this I remember this specifically. He said when he was in law school at University of Syracuse, or Syracuse University, he won the World Moot Court Championship. And I was like, wow. And he said that. And I remember hearing it. And I was like, it was such an odd fact that it stuck in my mind. I guarantee it's in the transcript I wrote that day, but I'm pretty sure it never happened. But,
I don't think the World Moot Court Championship even exists.
Right.
I went to law school. I remember moot court. I don't remember anything about a world championship.
Yeah. He had this, it was one of those bragging points. I did this. I won the moot court.
Isn't there some controversy as to what college he attended or graduated from? I thought somebody was catching him on that. What is that?
So that was just him being Joe. He used to say, it was Delaware State University is I think it's a historically black college and university. I think it's an HBCU. It's mostly a black college. What he meant was he went to Delaware State, and the faculty there, as he was campaigning to be a senator, was very welcoming. And they gave him a lot of positive feedback. And so he got his start there. And that's what he said in a speech. He said, I got my start at Delaware State University. And everybody thought it meant his scholastic start. But I think what he meant was his senatorial start.
Gotcha. And then what about some of the, really serious stories, for instance, about his his first wife being killed in a car crash with his daughter, correct? It was his wife and his daughter?
Right. Yeah. I mean, does
he tell that story in much detail? And is there ever any contradictory statements about that?
All I put in my book was what he spoke of as a vice president. Looking back in his history, there was a lot of discussion that he would admit to having been very angry. When I first got to the Senate, I was so angry about it. I'd walk around D.C. trying to look for somebody to punch. Later, after the truck driver died, Joe Biden came out and said that the truck driver had been drinking and he ran the red light and killed his family. And the family of the truck driver had to sue Joe Biden to stop it. And finally, he did stop it. I didn't really talk about that in the book. I said, he kind of talked about this accident. Some of what he said was bad. Mostly what he said was good. He talked about it a lot, and he used that as a way to help people understand grief in their life. So he did that a lot he did a great speech for Gold Star Family organization, how you're going to get past your grief. And it really was, and I talked about it in my book too, it really was one of his better speeches. There's an aspect to Joe Biden where he is Joe Biden. So he's got all these flaws, but he also has a very strong empathy for people and understanding, and people are drawn to that. So, is that a good president? In my book, not.
So going back to the accident with his wife, is it understood? I mean, who was at fault in the accident? I feel like I read something recently. I'm just going to say what I read because I don't know if it's true or not, that perhaps it was her fault or she was actually under the influence.
Oh, I've never heard that.
Okay.
Joe's never said that. I've only heard about the accident from him. Basically what he'd say was, my wife and kids were out Christmas shopping. They were shopping for a Christmas tree. They came home and they got, broadsided by a truck. He said it was really hard for me to live with that tragedy. And it was right after he'd been elected. So he was in D.C. hiring staff. He said, I got the phone call no one wants to get, pit in my stomach. And
so what was the defamation then that the family of the truck driver was asserting?
So at the time, it was just a terrible accident. Kids were both boys, Bo and Hunter, were in the hospital, badly hospitalized. He talked about how they had, this sort of recovery. He went back and forth. He commuted back and forth on Amtrak because of this accident. His family was sort of enveloped his kids. His sister took them into her household. So they sort of had this giant household, and he'd go back and forth every day from Wilmington to be with his kids. He didn't want to be sworn into the Senate originally. He kind of wanted to just sort of balk at the whole thing, but the senior senators talked him into it. They swore him in the hospital. They sent the Secretary of the Senate up there to swear him in the hospital because he didn't want to leave his kids. So they got him sworn in, and then he started his Senate career, and it grew and grew. And then, a few years later, he married Jill. Every year,
and the boys. Sorry, about how old were the boys at the time of the accident?
I think it was 4 and 2.
Wow.
I think it was 4 and 2. Bo was 4 and Hunter was maybe it was 6 and 5 and 4. I think Hunter was right around 4. I can't remember. I think Bo was a year or two older.
And then when does Jill come along?
So every year on December 18th, Joe would take the entire day off. They would go back to Wilmington. They would have a private day at the cemetery, family only, no business events every year. So he honored that memory. I think that was pretty important to I talked about that in the book too. So it was something that really was important to him through his life, and he honored that. I appreciated that about him. Jill came about, I think 5 years after the accident they met. Now, there was some book that came out this summer that had this whole different narrative about where they met and how they met. And, it was Jill's ex-husband that wrote it. So that was very strange to me to read that. That's a whole different turn on the story.
Is he saying that she married at the time that she met Joe?
Yes, right. She was married to this guy. This guy ran a famous rock and roll nightclub in, I think, New Jersey, Asbury Park, the Stone Pony. And so, he had this sort of high profile lifestyle, and she got wrapped up into politics and really fell for Joe. Joe's story on it was always that he had met her. He was walking through an airport or a train station and saw this beautiful woman in this poster on the wall. He asked his brother, "Who is that?" His brother set him up on a blind date. The date went well. He wound up asking her to marry him 5 times before she said yes. And, the rest is history. He said she fell in love with the boys.
But but these dates that he went on with her was while she was married.
No, this is his story. So the Jill is, by this time, in his version and her version, she was divorced. She had met him on a blind date. So their version is different than the ex-husband's version.
And what does he say?
He said that they were conducting an affair, he thought, and that it started while they were married, and then it lasted, kind of went underground for a couple of years, and then he started dating her publicly, and then eventually they got married.
Mm-hmm. And she had children already?
No. Mm-mm.
And then she and Joe had how many children?
Daughter Ashley.
Just a daughter. So now he has one son, one daughter, and they are half siblings.
Two sons and a daughter.
Well,
Hunter,
sorry. One son
Hunter,
left, unfortunately.
Bo, Hunter, and Ashley. Yep.
Right. Okay. Just real quick, back to the accident, though. I just wanted to button up something. So, what is it that the family of the truck driver was saying when they wanted Joe to stop telling a certain story? What was the point there?
So what happened was, and I know this just from sort of reading it on, news reports on the internet, but in the immediate aftermath of the accident, everybody just sort of went their separate ways. Joe dealt with his grief. The truck driver wasn't charged. There was no charges. He was never convicted of anything. Years later, like in the 90s, after the truck driver has passed away, Joe starts putting out public statements that the truck driver was drunk when he ran into my family. And the truck driver's family takes issue with that and has to go to the point, first they asked him to stop, then they had to go to the point of suing him, threatening to sue him for libel if he didn't stop, and finally he stopped. So that's the ugly side of Joe. He's got an ugly side where he can go and be ugly with people.
Well, I'm guessing he was trying to use that for some political advantage, because it's always more sympathetic, it seems, that if you're hit by a drunk driver, and I don't know, that would be my little theory there.
Right.
I mean, bottom line, do you happen to know, was it very clear who was at fault, that it clearly was the truck driver's fault?
I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Okay, what about, since you dealt with him so much, the famous Joe Biden temper, what did you Tell us about what you learned about his temper in spending so much time with him, listening.
You know, it's funny. I've heard his staff talk about his temper pretty bad. He was pretty rough on staff, and there are other members of the staff who are just amazingly loyal to him. I'm not sure why certain members of the staff got roughed up and others were untouchable. I don't know how that worked in his office. I do know he used to talk about his temper a lot. And one time he had this weird story where when he was a kid, he went to the donut shop after church, and his sister had told him there was a boy who had done something really mean to her in school. And Joe goes to the donut shop after church and sees the boy standing in the donut shop with his family. And he smashes the kid into the donut shop case and breaks the glass in the donut shop donut case in front of this kid's family because he was mean to his sister. I mean, it was just a bizarre story for a guy at this point of his career as a vice president, is going back in his childhood and talks about this anger issue that he has. And I only heard that story once, but it was so bizarre, I remembered it. And, so that's a story. It's in a transcript somewhere in one of those transcripts. He would go on these sort of diatribes, or he would get on this memory lane in front of certain audiences, and the stuff would just come out.
Yeah, well, we've seen some of it firsthand at some of these press conferences that he did, or town halls, right? Where he abruptly calls the woman a dog-faced pony, whatever the heck he says.
Right.
Did you hear a lot of that in all the transcripts or that you created?
Every once in a while, if someone was in the audience, so you got to understand, this is the Obama years. Everybody adored Joe Biden and Barack Obama in the audience, whether it was the press or the attendees. So there wasn't a lot of contention. Every once in a while, there'll be a kind of a contentious person, and Joe would say, "Oh, tough guy, what?" He would just sort of go at him, or he would see somebody sort of scowling at him. He'd say, "Hey, tough guy, what are you scowling at?" He'd sort of call the guy out, or woman, at the edge of the stage if they were, just sort of, but very rarely. So,
he does seem to, though, have pretty thin skin, right? When somebody does kind of come at him with a tough question. I mean, we seem to have seen that many times.
Yes and no. He sort of sets up this bluster, and then he kind of bluffs back at the person. But to me, I wouldn't say it's a thin skin. I mean, he took some. I'm standing there and watching him get completely publicly humiliated by Vladimir Putin, and he rolled around and just did exactly what Vladimir Putin wanted. So, was it tough skin, or was it being, manipulated? I don't know. There's a judgment call there for somebody. That's
and what about that phrase, lying dog face pony boy or whatever?
Pony soldier, yeah.
Pony soldier. Did you hear him use that many times? Or is that a new thing in the past year?
I might have heard that once or twice. It didn't surprise me when he said it. He had sort of these old school phrases that he would use. I might have heard that before, but not specifically to somebody like that. It's kind of demeaning to this person that's just standing there talking to him, a voter. That was weird.
So we'll get into some of the details I know that you've talked about in prior speeches or in the book. So one of them you mentioned was the Biden speech never heard. What is that all about?
So Joe Biden in 2011, he gave what I thought was the best White House speech I've ever heard. In Delaware, they have something called Constitution Day. So he went up to the University of Delaware and he gave the speech in honor of Constitution Day at his alma mater. Small group, all Delaware, mostly friends, but there were some Republicans in the audience. And it was a written speech, but he really riffed off of it in a lot of places. I thought it was probably one of the best speeches. I learned so much about the Constitution there. He used to be a constitutional professor. That's an interesting fact about that White House. Both he and Barack Obama were constitutional professors. Joe taught a constitutional course at a small college in Delaware. So he knew what he was talking about. And so he gets into the speech and he starts talking about elements of eavesdropping and how government surveillance is a really bad thing. Well, I mean, basically, he basically foreshadowed what his government did to Donald Trump's campaign. They eavesdropped on his campaign. He made it sound like this horrific thing. The timing of the speech was to talk about the Tea Party movement. He was trying to say, look, we've got to work together. We've always been this country that comes to compromise, but we have, and so that was the kind of the element of his speech. But by the end of his speech, he'd gone beyond compromise. He was talking about, there's this speech was given the actions that were taking place then and there in the Democratic Party. That's when Occupy Wall Street moved into Zuccotti Park the very next day. And from then on, what I heard in the White House out of Barack Obama, mostly, not sometimes Joe Biden, we don't need any more millionaires and billionaires. They were always lambasting millionaires and billionaires. They tried to make the Republican Party the party of millionaires and billionaires. And look where that got them. They got them to the era of Donald Trump.
Yeah. Okay. Tell us the Putin story, because for this story, you were actually there in the room.
Oh, and one other thing that was interesting about that speech, the greatest speech you never heard. So he goes into the speech and he's digging up all this stuff from his past about all these segregationists. I worked with these guys, and he named them in the speech. So this is the guy who, after over the past year, he had to apologize over and over for having talked, nicely about these segregationists. But that's what he did in the speech. And so what I talked about was the point of the chapter was, look, Joe Biden gave this speech in 2011. It was a great speech. If he gave that to his Democratic Party now, they would refuse to vote for him. So he basically changed his philosophy about, working along with people, getting along with people, whether they're segregationists or not. You got to work together in the Senate. He was talking about,
I got you. So the point of that, because you do hear a lot about that. So that's a good thing to get clarified. So this was his way of saying that, hey, you got to work with everybody. It's reaching across the aisle. It's working with Republicans, et cetera. So his point was, and I even worked with segregationists
in his own party, and there were a lot of them. And he names them, James O. Eastland, and he would always talk about that guy.
But so it's not necessarily he's getting lambasted because in this cancel woke culture, you're not allowed to have any interaction with anybody who said an ill thing about anybody who happens to have black skin or whatever, right? So really, almost it seems like we should be on Joe's side on this one. That hey, the fact that he pointed out segregationists, he's pointing out because I don't agree with segregationists. I so disagree with them that I'm using them, though, to highlight the fact that I still was willing to work with them as much as I disagreed with them, because you have to work together.
Right.
So instead,
Yeah. That Democratic, in that era, at that time, his Democratic Party could tolerate that speech. They are the party of intolerance now, and they can't tolerate him making that same speech now. And that was the point.
So you're saying he has actually apologized for that speech now?
Yeah, he's changed completely his, the way he presents how he worked with segregationists, his past, and, how he would deal with, people like that. He just sort of, and basically, he didn't have to explain himself. He spent the whole summer in his basement. No one asked him these things.
Now people have actually claimed that Biden has his own racist, in quotes, past. Is that their evidence of it, or is there other things that he did that, for instance, I think it was Kamala Harris that said that Biden, opposed or was in favor of busing. Yeah,
she was talking about that, and she was talking about this speech, this association he had with these segregationists early in his career.
Okay. And well, I think that's nonsense then, in my opinion. And then the other issue is being for or against busing, and I'm not sure that a racist, there's, as Trump says, good people on both sides of the issue of busing, right? As to whether busing is a good thing or not a good thing.
I wrote 2 books. So the first book, I talk about racism in the White House, what I saw as a White House stenographer of racism in the White House. And what I say is every president who ever gets elected to the White House manipulates racism in America to get there. Whether they do it to highlight it for their whatever voting group You don't get to be elected president in America if you don't know how to manipulate racism. So the racism is a part of politics. And is he a racist? Is Joe Biden a racist? I wouldn't say that. Does he have a patronizing attitude about race to some people? I would say that. That came across to me as sort of how he handled Barack Obama early on in their association. So, you know, that people, it depends what your definition of racism is.
Right.
Some people would take issue with Joe Biden for that patronizing. Some people wouldn't. It's really down to that. And that's kind of how the whole thing with Trump is. They've defined him as a racist to the point where it's kind of lost its potency. And now you've got...
Well, these days, if you don't support everything that Black Lives Matter stands for, you're a racist. So that's the new definition of a racist in America. So it's just ridiculous. The term has just lost all of its import. But yeah, that reminds me that that Biden has gotten in trouble, and I think it is patronizing when he says that, "Oh, hey, man, you're a black man. You ain't black unless you're supporting me." Right. All blacks have to think alike, and he's telling them what they have to think. So that's closer to racist than lumping all people in a certain race. But you know what it really is? I mean, another way of putting it is stereotyping. And, you know, these days people, like I said, they've just lost all track of the meaning of words. Stereotyping versus being racist are two totally different things. Simply because you stereotype a race, I don't believe, in my opinion, that it's racist. People stereotype all the time. It doesn't mean it's always a good thing to stereotype. You know, stereotyping can be smart in certain circumstances and not good in other circumstances, but it's not inherently bad. Whereas racism is obviously inherently bad.
Yeah, and you know, the results of the election bear out the fact that there's a lot of people in America who don't think Donald Trump is a racist.
Yeah.
And
what I like to point is nobody thought he was a racist before he got elected. I never heard Donald Trump being as big of a high profile person as he was. I never heard him accused of being a racist until now. Actually, I just noticed Michelle Obama was making some statement just in the past couple of days where she called his attacks on Barack racist attacks because of the whole, you know, the birth certificate thing.
Right. And that's what I was talking about. That's the manipulation of race. So, you know, you can look at that. Politics is a tough business. It's not tiddlywinks. You know, you got to have broad shoulders. So Barack Obama comes in and they start attacking him on his birth certificate and all this. It's just politics. But they turn it into, oh, it's racism. It's racism. They really destroyed the fragile relationship between Democrat Party constituencies with their trumpeting of the racist cause over all else. They put it out in front of everything. They put it out in front of economic development and so many other things. And that's where Donald Trump walked in.
Yeah. Well, they think they're being smart as far as how they use race to divide America. I think it's primarily the anarchists and revolutionaries that want to divide us based on race, and the Democrats are just kind of going along with it because they're in their party, and so nobody likes to criticize people in their own party. But you're starting to hear more and more where they're realizing, guys, that's not the direction our party should be headed in. This recent election tends to have been a little bit of a lesson to them about that.
Right.
That trying to divide us on race is not a good idea. Okay, what about the Putin story?
So I'm traveling overseas with Joe Biden, and the first trip we took was to Russia. This is a big thing for Joe Biden. And it's interesting, with Obama's memoir just coming out recently, he kind of talked about this meeting he had with Putin that went 45 minutes. Well, on the plane over, the people in Biden's press office were telling me, look, we got to go in and we're going to meet with Putin. And Putin just reamed Obama inside out in this meeting he had with him. He couldn't get a word in edgewise. So if this is a big deal for Joe Biden to go in there and prove, remember I said he was patronizing at the beginning of the administration to prove what an old, experienced hand he is. So he goes in there with Putin, and Putin saw him coming from a mile away.
Okay, now, just to set the tone, I want to make sure everything's clear here. So Were you with him for the meeting, or you heard the meeting or saw the meeting afterwards?
So the meeting takes place in Moscow. There's this gigantic government building there called the White House of Moscow. It's basically the building that the tanks were blowing up with the tanks in before Putin got in there. Who was the guy, the big white-haired guy?
Yeltsin?
Anyway, Yeltsin, yeah. Yeltsin blew that thing up with tanks to kill the other guys. It was opposition parties. So that's the White House in Moscow. So we go into this, at the time, Putin was the prime minister, not the president, the prime minister, sort of a second command. And, Medvedev
was president.
Yeah, president. So, Putin was this was kind of a courtesy call, but everybody knew Putin was really still calling shots. We go into this big White House building, big blah, Soviet architecture, really dull. And they had a meeting, like a grip and grin, they called in Putin's office. And then there was this sort of conference table set up. And one side was American, the other side was Putin. And as me, a member of the White House press group, we walked in to this room, and there was a whole bunch of local press up in a corner of the room. TV cameras, video cameras, still photographs, and they had TV lights. They had retractable lights. So we walked in, and we were sort of in their shot, so we had to go back and flatten up against the wall. So I was standing with my recorder running about five feet behind Putin as he's standing there talking to Biden. He's speaking Russian. There's a interpreter. Biden's sitting right across the table from him. I'm recording this, and Putin, and I put the whole transcript of the event in the book. But Putin, he's a smart guy. He's a KGB guy, and he knew Biden. He knew exactly what buttons to push on Biden to manipulate him. He said, "Oh, you've been here a lot. Tell us about the last time you came here." Well, finally, after Biden gets his chance to talk, he starts talking about, "I've been here a long time," after a whole bunch of stuff. Well, bang, off go the TV lights. Everything shuts down. The mics are down. And Putin's just looking at Biden going and Biden's looking around the room like, what's going on? Never say, "Hey, I wasn't done talking." He was right in the middle of a sentence. Everybody's hushed out of the room. The Russian voices, "Get out, get out, get out." So we all left, and that was it. That's where the transcript ends. Putin just shut him down right in the middle. I mean, I've never seen that happen in any meeting I've been. I've been in hundreds of world leader meetings.
And sorry, to be clear, you're saying that was the first opportunity Biden had to speak?
First and only he ever met with Putin.
So Putin...
No, it wasn't the first. So Biden goes into his remarks. He kind of I'm here. Putin does his remarks. In the beginning of his remarks, he says, "Tell us about your time in Moscow. I know you've been here a lot of times." And then he does this sort of little gotcha thing where he goes, "Oh, and I think we should change the way visas are set up so that Russian people can go into the United States and into the European Union visa-free." It's like, that's ridiculous. Who's going to go for that? So Biden
who suggested that?
Putin. He tried to do it. It was like a gotcha, right?
Uh-huh.
We want to have visa access. It's like EU guys. They're like, no way. So Biden sort of catches him. He says, "Oh, that's above my pay grade. I'm not gonna talk about that." So then he goes into, the standard sort of boilerplate. "We've been here. You're doing great, blah, blah, blah." And then finally he starts talking about, "I've been doing this a long time." And as soon as he says that, bang, off go the lights, shuts down the microphone. And, basically he publicly humiliated him. No one here heard about it. It wasn't reported in the press. The guy who was the pool reporter from the Wall Street Journal wrote a pool report about it. I tried to get the pool report from the White House Press Association this summer or last summer, and when I was writing the book, and they wouldn't, I never heard back from them. So I know that he talked about it to me. He said, "Yeah, that was Joe Biden got gonged in Moscow twice. It happened twice. He basically got publicly humiliated over there." The very next day he goes out and he writes this op-ed article in the International Herald Tribune about Russia should get ascension to the World Trade Organization, because that's what Putin wanted. So that's 2011. By 2012, they've given Putin what he wants, that Russia gets ascension to the World Trade Organization. They're campaigning for the presidency in 2012 on the fact that Mitt Romney is an idiot for saying, Russia is our most dangerous geopolitical foe. And they, in August, they're saying, oh, well, we got Putin and he's on our side. Well, guess what? 2 years later, he wasn't on their side. So in my mind, this whole episode, it just was like there never was a Russian reset. That's what Joe Biden was there to promote, this Russian reset. It was all just a mirage. And so much of the Obama years was like that. They say we did this great thing. It wasn't like that. Joe Biden would say, that's what happened in Iraq. The Iraq war drawdown was just a horrific Joe Biden mirage, time and time again.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So basically, as soon as Biden wanted to get into any substance, Putin was kicking him out the door.
Yeah, he humiliated him. The whole point of the meeting.
And Biden didn't push back in any way?
No.
He just walked out the room with his tail between his legs?
Basically. I mean, we walked out. I don't know. They kept going with the meeting. So I'm not sure exactly what the frame of events afterwards was, but people were mad. The White House, VP staffers were really mad.
So I've had a theory that it's not just mine, but that, Obama never really saw Biden as presidential material, and hence why he supported Clinton and not Biden as his potential successor, and hence why it took him so long to finally come out and endorse his own former vice president as among the candidates for president this year. It wasn't until way at the end that he finally came out and said, I support Joe Biden, when he was the only man standing. So do you have any thoughts about that, things that you observed or saw as far as Obama believing in Biden?
Well, in my mind and in my book and what I write about is, I think Obama was horrified when Biden became the candidate this past winter. I think that was a really bad thing. If you look, and not just Obama, but Obama's people, Axelrod, Plouffe, those guys never got along with Biden. And if you look back at some of the stuff that Axelrod said about Biden's candidacy from a year ago, he was pretty critical of the way he was running his candidacy, how he was campaigning, the whole thing. I think it comes out of the Burisma stuff. What I found in my book and what I write about is that Joe Biden committed malfeasance in office. I think there was an important meeting in April 2014 by Obama and his brain trust, Axelrod, Plouffe, Messina, without Joe Biden there, because they were really worried about what Joe Biden is doing is really stupid. At that point in time, they would have known Hunter Biden had been kicked out of the Navy Reserve for cocaine use. He had just done this $3.5 million money transfer that came through in February. So Obama's Treasury Department would have told him that. One of the things you learn in the White House is how much information those guys get on a regular basis. It's just flooded in there. Stuff doesn't get past them. So they would have known that about their vice president. And
so
I think
you make a
so
couple
they had a meeting.
Yeah, so you make a few assertions, and I want to kind of test them to find out what you're basing them on. So you make an assertion that Joe Biden, was instrumental in getting his son on the Burisma board, that it was the former president of Poland who was also on the board and a friend of Biden's that helped get Hunter onto the board, and that subsequently you believe there was a meeting that involved Obama and Axelrod, et cetera, where they discussed their concern about Joe Biden using influence to get his son on the board, right?
Correct.
So let's start with, what is your basis of knowing that Biden had this close relationship with the former Polish president, that he was on the board, and that's how Hunter got on the board?
So the story, January 2014, Alexander Kwasniewski is a well-regarded ex-president of Poland in the European circles. He's an old friend of Joe Biden's. They worked together when Joe Biden was the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. They worked together on getting Poland pulled into NATO, the NATO enlargement, and included Poland in the early 2000s. So they were old buddies. Out of that, Kwasniewski becomes a guest lecturer at Georgetown University. Hunter Biden went to Georgetown, and Joe was a big Georgetown supporter. So they would have crossed paths in D.C. and stuff like that. They were personal friends. Joe Biden talked about that. In 2019, in July, there was an article written about Hunter Biden's cocaine habits and his cruddy lifestyle in the New Yorker by a guy named Adam Entis. Adam basically got a half confession out of Hunter Biden. In that article, Hunter Biden exclaimed that Alexander Kwasniewski was the guy that recruited him to the Burisma board in early 2014. Devin Archer said Alexander Kwasniewski was the guy that recruited him to the board in early 2014, after having met with the head of Burisma Holdings, which is a guy named Mykola Zlochevsky. Joe Biden went to Poland in March 2014. And as he went there, he was talking about Ukrainian natural gas, supporting the Ukrainian natural gas industry. That's what's in the preliminary indication of the reason for his trip. I'm going to Poland. We're going to reinforce Poland and tell them, as Putin has invaded Ukraine, we're not going to let him invade Poland. We're not going to let him invade Lithuania. We were on that trip. I was on that plane. We went to Poland and went to Lithuania. I guarantee, as someone who knows Joe Biden, he knew his friend was on the board of Burisma. He knew and he was going to Poland to talk about, supporting the Ukrainian natural gas industry. He would have called him or met him on the ground about.
Let me stop you there. Why is the vice president of the United States talking about natural gas in Ukraine? What's the geopolitical significance of that?
Joe Biden in 2009, when he first became president, he went to Ukraine, summer trip. And after that, he came back and became the head of the White House Working Group on Ukrainian energy security. Because at the time, Russia was holding Ukraine's pipeline transfers hostage. They basically were leveraging Ukraine's economy by shutting down their end of the pipeline. Ukraine had this huge natural gas pipelines, and that's what Putin was doing it. So it was it was an international security development that Joe Biden was aware of. As Ukraine fights for their independence in 2014 and gets that independence, and Joe Biden is in on helping them get that independence, that's February 2014. Then Putin invades in March 2014. The next thing that Joe Biden does is he goes to Poland, and he's talking about natural gas security for Ukraine, because that's something that's always been sort of bubbling on the pot in the back of the stove. Do you think, my audience, I invite my readers to conceive, Joe Biden went over there, he talked to Kwasniewski as part of this trip, said, I'll be helping Ukraine, I'll be helping Burisma Holdings, you're on their board, I want Hunter on that board too, quid pro quo. He comes back from that trip, he starts setting up a trip to Ukraine, taking a whole bunch of American energy security assistance, and $1 billion in a loan guarantee for the IMF. $1 billion. And who knows what happens with $1 billion in Ukraine. As he's doing that trip, there are meetings in the White House. April 15th, 2014, in the afternoon, Obama meets with Axelrod, Plouffe, and Messina. It's in the White House visitor logs. I literally stumbled across it. I was looking for this. You were talking about that guy who wrote the book Profiles in Corruption.
Peter Schweitzer.
Peter Schweitzer. So he had this meeting that Biden had with Devin Archer in his office on April 16th, 2014. So I was looking over, well, what's going on April 16th, 2014? I found the meeting in the White House logs with Devin Archer. Then I looked at, what else was going on on April 16th? And I went to I did a search for the first entry of the White House visitor logs. It's on an Excel spreadsheet. And I searched by the date. The first name that was on that day was David Axelrod. And I looked across the row and it said VPR. It didn't have a lot of other information. It had his name, it had VPR, and it had breakfast. VPR, I know, means Vice President's residence. That sent alarm bells ringing for me, because there's no way David Axelrod wants to hang out with Joe Biden for breakfast. They don't like each other. There's a lot of tension between the two over the years. As I said, Joe Biden was patronizing to Obama early in the administration. David Axelrod was patronizing right back to Joe Biden and Hunter Biden. And they knew Hunter Biden was a train wreck. So they have this meeting. After the meeting, David Axelrod has breakfast first thing in the morning with Joe Biden, one-on-one. 4 hours later, Joe Biden has a meeting in his West Wing office with Devon Archer, Hunter Biden's business partner. 4 days after that, he's off to Ukraine to bring this energy assistance package and a whole bunch of money. A month after that, Joe Biden goes to Cyprus. No one's really talking about this trip to Cyprus.
And hold on, sorry. When was Hunter actually put on the board?
Hunter was put on the board. It's the exact dates on or about April 18th, 2014. So shortly after they have these meetings, on or about April 18th, the official public announcement of Hunter being on the board comes out in the middle of May. A week after that public announcement, Joe Biden is in Cyprus, which is where Burisma Holdings is registered. That's where I believe Mykola Zlochevsky was. And I think Joe Biden went there. There was no press on the trip. I didn't go on that trip. I went to Ukraine with Joe. I didn't go to Cyprus. And so I think they had a nondescript meeting off-site. We don't know. What I always say throughout the book is nobody's asking these questions. These questions have to be asked. I took all this information to the FBI on the Monday before the election. I called up their tip line and said, hey, look, you guys got all this stuff about this Hunter Biden laptop. I know there's an open investigation into him for money laundering. This is the information I have. And I told the FBI, bing, 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 bing. And I told them some other stuff, too, that I didn't put in the book.
Okay, so let's break down some of that. So obviously a lot of this is speculation, but perhaps, intelligent speculation. So you're speculating, though, that in the meeting that did not include Biden, that they were concerned about Biden's dealings, getting so close to Burisma and having his son on the board, right? Or about to be on the board. And then the next day, the logs show an Axelrod and Biden meeting, right? Where theoretically...
Very unusual. Very unusual.
Theoretically, the results of the day before's meeting would have been communicated.
Right.
It would have been, to follow your theory, a slap on the wrist from Axelrod to Biden about his son?
Or no, don't do it, Joe. Don't do it. Joe ignored him. You know, Joe Biden was, they could have had either of those meetings. If they wanted Joe Biden included in any of those meetings with them, he was in the White House the morning of the April 15th. He was in the White House the morning of April 16th. So obviously they had a meeting. He could have been as part of their meeting group if they wanted him, but they wanted him not to be in their group.
Okay. And so now this next part I think is really important, because I want to talk about ways in which U.S. interests were aligned with Burisma, but then you've got this big fraud investigation, this prosecutor who's investigating Burisma. So first of all, on one hand, Burisma and the U.S., our interests were aligned. We don't want to see Russia come in and invade Ukraine or have its thumb over Ukraine. We want Ukrainian independence. And if key to their independence, one of them is energy, then having a strong Burisma is a good thing. Right so far?
Yes, correct.
Okay, so in that sense, you can look at it through that lens and say, well, what's the big deal if the vice president's son is on the board of this big gas company that we wholeheartedly support? But, even as I say that, I don't believe it, because even if we support them, that's still a conflict of interest, because they're going to be wanting more U.S. aid, and the U.S. should aid them. There's a proper amount to aid them and an improper amount to aid them, right? Maybe it makes sense to give them $1 billion. It doesn't make sense to give them $10 billion. But you got the vice president's son on the board pushing for and helping them push for more U.S. aid, right?
Yeah. The critical element here is what Joe Biden said. Joe Biden said, I never talked to my son about his overseas business. So there's basically a lie. If he put his son on the board of Burisma, to me, that's malfeasance in office. He's using his office to put his son on this board to benefit him, because he's going to go over there and help out Burisma on this program. Hey, look, Kwasniewski, I'm coming over there. I got all this stuff going on. Put Hunter and Devin Archer on the board. Well, it'll work out great for everybody.
And by the way, to be clear, I wasn't aware of this. So his partner, Devin Archer, was also on the board?
Correct.
Okay. And quick side question. Have you ever heard anyone from the Obama administration say something critical publicly or, on the record about the fact that Hunter was on that board?
Yeah. Not specifically critical. Basically, they punted. The questions came out of the White House press office to the White House briefing room that day. And Josh Earnest said, I'm going to refer all those questions to the office of the vice president. And the office of the vice president just said, Joe Biden doesn't have any connection with this company. And that was it. Everybody, the press basically just, oh, okay, great. They just took it for what it was. But everybody knew it was stinky. And that's
am I correct that Burisma got money from the U.S. government?
We don't know. It should be looked into. What was on the aid package was Joe Biden did this speech and he talked about, we're coming over there and we're going to support you with investments. And we've got teams on the ground that are helping you with, it sounded like technical information. It's hard to say. Nobody's looked into it. Joe Biden said, I never talked to my son about his business. And now it's all like his son was on this board. Did Joe Biden do it? I think somebody should say. And the thing about the Cyprus trip, when that fell in place, I was like, this is really suspicious. Cyprus is where, it's a money laundering capital of the world. What did Joe Biden set up in Cyprus? Was it something he set up with Burisma? Because Joe Biden had a reason to go to Cyprus to talk about Cyprus unification. That was a pet project of his. And I talk about that in the book too. But that's another Joe Biden mirage. We're going to unify Cyprus. Joe Biden used to say, if we saw the problems in Cyprus basically is divided. It's an island in the Mediterranean, half Greece, half Turkey, big war back in the 70s. It's divided now. He was negotiating through Turkey and Greece for years because he had Greek American donors who were really adamant. They wanted, this resolution. It would be good for them. So Joe was always doing it, and he went to Cyprus eventually. And on the side, did he meet with the Burisma guys? We don't know. Somebody should ask. Nobody asks.
Okay, so what do you know about corruption at Burisma, what the prosecutor was looking into, et cetera?
So I was on that trip. That was December 2015. What happened was I remember Joe Biden went to Ukraine 4 times. That was my 4th and final time in Ukraine with him. He went over again in the fall of 2014. And basically that's when on the street, somebody asked him, a reporter, a guy named Justin Sink from Bloomberg at the time said, what about you and Hunter and this natural gas company? And, Joe Biden looked at him and said, I never talked to my son about his business, but it was to me, it was a lie, but that's what the press wrote. They took that as face value. Later, 2015, the prosecutor general of Ukraine is looking into Burisma corruption. And it's Ukraine. There's so much corruption there, it's hard to tell who's good, who's not good. There was on that trip, there was an off-the-record meeting with the press people. There was quite a few press on that trip in a restaurant with the Ambassador Pyatt. And he talked to them about the Ukrainian situation. And, we've got this there's corruption here. We want to try to weed it out. So the very next day, Joe goes into the Rada, that's their Ukrainian, sort of their Congress, and he does this big speech. At the conclusion, and he's pretty tough on corruption in Ukraine in the speech. At the conclusion of the speech, he has a meeting with the president, Poroshenko, and this guy, Yatsenyuk, Prime Minister Yatsenyuk. Those guys come out of this meeting looking pretty grim. It's, I think, in that meeting where Joe Biden tells them, I'm going to be on a plane in 6 hours. You guys, I've got $1 million in aid with me. It's not coming to you unless you fire this guy. And, then he was fired. And so that's what, when Joe was bragging about that. So I didn't know this at the time, right? We didn't know this. In August 2016, Joe Biden described that episode in an interview he had with a guy from the Atlantic magazine. So that's where I first heard it, August 2016. there's that Joe Biden thing. He always says, I say all that I mean. So he's saying it to this guy, sort of bragging about it. And that's what he said on TV later in front of the Council of Foreign Relations. Son of a bitch, the guy got fired. Well, that's what Trump heard, and Trump went after him because he thought there was corruption there. And there was corruption there. And that's when Trump got impeached.
Yeah.
And so to me, the impeachment was over a lie, a Joe Biden lie.
Yeah. So there's an extra wrinkle to that story that I want to cover, but on the surface, it sounds incredibly corrupt that the vice president would dangle aid in front of the Ukrainians and saying, I'll give it to you, provided that you fire the prosecutor who's going after the company that my son is on the board of, right?
Right.
That seems like a no-brainer, inappropriate, hardcore corruption on the behalf of Joe Biden. However, aren't I correct that the extra wrinkle to that is there were other countries that wanted this prosecutor gone, that there was U.S. interest that wanted this prosecutor gone. So Biden can hide behind, or at least state that, no, I was doing this on behalf of the U.S. government because we didn't like this prosecutor for X, Y, Z reason.
Right. And that came out of that dinner that Ambassador Pyatt had with the press. That's where that reporting came. But yes, it's Ukraine. It's hard to tell who's corrupt and who's not. So was the guy corrupt? Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. Was he looking into Burisma? It's still hard to tell.
So let me ask you about what was the allegation about this prosecutor? Was it that he was being too tough on Burisma, or that he was being not tough enough?
I think he was being the Joe Biden version of the allegation was he was a corrupt prosecutor who was not being tough enough. But at the time, they didn't acknowledge that he was looking into Burisma. That was never mentioned by the Biden side. That was never mentioned out of the Obama White House circles. That came out later. And that came out because that's, basically the guy's version, the prosecutor's version. And there's a, like I said, it's great. There's a lot of questions. Well, was he looking into it, or was he dragging his feet? It's hard to tell. There's no real clear, definitive yes, no, yes, no. Mm-hmm. Hard to tell. So
Biden's story would be that
fire the guy? Maybe.
Yeah, Biden's story would be that he wasn't being tough enough. I mean, what about these other countries? Am I right that there was other countries that were also concerned about this?
I don't know about that.
Okay.
I don't know.
But according to Biden, the U.S. government's position was this guy was not being tough enough.
Right.
And do we know who he was replaced by, and then what happened with the new prosecutor?
I don't. I didn't put that in my book. That's not. To me, this episode of the corruption, the Biden Burisma story, was actually kind of small. To me, the really big stuff was in the beginning, where he put his son on the board. That's, to me, the malfeasance that he committed. This thing with the prosecutor, to me, it's White House gray area. You could go either way with it, and that's basically what they're hiding behind. I don't know, Yeah.
Well, and you're supposed to avoid the appearance of conflict of interest. So obviously, absolutely anything that the U.S. does that impacts Burisma has the appearance of a conflict because his son is on the board. And you're in the middle of this huge geopolitical battle between Russia and Ukraine, where Russia is invading Ukraine. They're taking their land. There's an ongoing war as we speak. A lot of it has to do with energy, and Ukraine's independence is dependent on having its own energy. Burisma is the primary provider of that. So all this is swirling around, and you put your son on the board of this company. I mean, what a lack of judgment.
Correct. And quick correction. Burisma is not the primary supplier of natural gas. They're the largest private natural gas company, but there's a nationalized natural gas company that's bigger. I don't know the name of it. So, the Burisma stuff is Joe Biden is sitting on top of it. He's kind of managing it, and everybody thinks, the allegation is he did this to help Burisma because he was, in their pocket kind of thing. We don't know. I don't know. It should be looked into. It's kind of is being looked into. What happened was I sent my book in June to every member of the Senate committee that was looking into the Hunter Biden allegations. Never heard back. Weirdly, about 10 days after I sent it to them, there was an arrest in Ukraine by the Ukrainian authorities arrested these two guys for trying to bribe. They were government officials who were being bribed by Burisma, $6 million bribe. They had all this big pile of money on this table. And that happened 10 days after I sent my book to the Senate. And it was like this weird thing. And the Washington Post wrote an article about it. And the very last paragraph, the prosecutor who announced this arrest says, this should put to rest that Hunter Biden and Joe Biden had nothing to do with this episode. I was like, what is that? Why are they saying that?
And when did Hunter leave the board?
Hunter didn't leave the board till 2019. So he stayed on that
anticipation of his dad running for office, perhaps.
Yeah, like I think it was the spring of 2019.
And what about Devin Archer?
I think the same time. Yeah, Devin Archer got himself in some trouble. He wound up being He wound up getting convicted of a securities fraud, pretty severe securities fraud. The conviction was overturned, and it's just recently being reinstated. He's about to get sentenced.
And do you believe that Hunter is at risk of criminal charges being brought against him?
I think there has to be a lot looked into with Hunter Biden, this laptop, the Burisma thing, and the stuff that I have in there about Obama and those guys knowing it. So those guys knew that Joe Biden had done this. I think that's why they didn't want him to run for the presidency. I think they felt like this thing was going to blow up. And the other question is, if Obama and Axelrod and Pluff and Messina knew, who else in the Democratic Party knew about this? I mean, this could go way into the Democratic Party. And this is known during the Democratic Party's impeachment of President Trump over looking into the corruption that Joe Biden may or may not have had with Burisma. And, to me, it's just like there's a lot going on there, and people really have to start digging. No one asked questions. The Senate didn't really ask questions. The FBI, maybe they will. Who knows?
Last question about Hunter, and then we'll wrap up. So you've been on Air Force Two. There's a story about Hunter Biden being on Air Force Two with his dad going to China and coming back with $1.5 billion of commitments to some type of a private equity fund or something. What do you know about that?
Well, I was on that trip.
China.
That trip's China, yeah.
So you were on the plane with Hunter and his dad?
With Hunter and his dad. It was December 2013. So this is right before all this Burisma stuff kicks off, right? December 2013, Hunter goes to China. Remember, at the time, Hunter Biden has been thrown out of the Navy for cocaine use. No one knows about it. It's not public knowledge until October 2014. So his cocaine problem son gets on his plane with him, goes to China. That's the only time I ever traveled with Hunter Biden on a foreign trip. Hunter and his brother would travel with their dad on Air Force Two regularly to go to campaign events. They were like his, sort of his cheering squad or something. So that wasn't unusual. And Joe would take his grandkids and his daughters-in-law on the plane rides often too. So on that trip, Hunter was with his daughter, Finnegan Biden. And so, it was kind of like a family trip, but it wasn't just a family trip, and it wasn't sightseeing. It was Hunter over there scamming on his dad's coattails. And that's what everybody now knows. The amount of money that guy got out of that and who it tied him into, the Chinese Communist Party, is, that's got to be looked into. It's starting to be looked into. That's what Mr. Tony Bobulinski came out with. He was like, hey, this is what they were doing, and so now the FBI is finally looking into it. They had this laptop for a year. They had the laptop all through the impeachment of President Trump. It's just,
Yeah, you have to wonder who Hunter was rooting for to win, because having Biden as president keeps the spotlight on Hunter, which is one way of looking at it. Whereas if Trump had won, maybe the story would have would have died. But then again, he's got the protection of his father now.
Right. We'll see. I mean, I saw some of the stuff on that laptop. Hunter Biden is a national security risk. There is no question in my mind that that guy shouldn't be anywhere near the White House ever again for whatever reason. And just on that, his father shouldn't be in the White House. But his father, Joe Biden, is not qualified to be president. I don't know what he's done with China over the years, exactly as far as the tie-ins. We're going to find out about that. I know that his association with Xi Jinping in China was something he bragged about incessantly right up until Donald Trump started getting tough on China, and Joe Biden didn't want to open his mouth about China. A really big connection that Joe Biden made, and I talk about it in my book, was he opened China up for a lot of Hollywood movie moguls. They had this sort of restriction on how many movies they could distribute in China. Joe Biden, in early 2012, February 2012, put together a deal out with Xi Jinping, who was vice president of China then, out in Hollywood, and it opened up the Hollywood market, opened up the Chinese market for Hollywood. That's why Joe Biden got into the presidency, because Hollywood was backing him. And now Hollywood is complaining about all the censorship and the cultural guidance they receive from China on their movies. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's, you want to take over the country, take over the culture. Thanks to Joe.
Yeah. Well, it's my hope that perhaps the Hunter stuff and so on is going to force Biden to at least appear tough on China and be tougher than he would have been otherwise.
I don't think Joe Biden gets to be president. Don't think he does.
Well, that's a subject for another interview. We'll hold that one. We're going to do Joe a favor and allow it to end on a positive note, because I know that despite your criticism of him, that you have a lot of positive things to say about him as a man.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, the last chapter I said, my word is Biden. Joe, and people that read the book appreciate it for being fair. And one of the things, my position was I was like a neutral observer. And I think what's really missing in our politics is somebody who can sort of stay in the middle and just see both sides. Joe Biden, the last line I have of my book is, Joe Biden is a great American. He will never be president. And I say that because he did some great things. If it wasn't for Joe, I don't think we would have got the gay marriage, the appreciation and the national recognition of the need for legalizing gay marriage. Joe Biden did that. And he was a great dad. And unfortunately, he went through this horrible tragedy with his son dying at the end of his term. So that was a pretty tough time. And, I thought when he was in the office, he did a great job with that cancer moonshot. And I kind of think he should keep doing it. The reporting that's come out about it recently is that, he's just basically raising all this money and spending on staff and not giving it away to anybody. That doesn't surprise me, unfortunately. That's the bad side of Joe. But Joe does have a good side. And, trying to fight through the bureaucracy around cancer research was something he was really invested in.